My name is Jonathan Bach. I'm a professor of global studies here at the New School, and I have had a long affiliation with the India-China Institute from pretty much its very beginning, working with Ashok and Grace, and then everyone since then. So it's truly a pleasure and an honor to be part of this 20th anniversary celebrations. I'm here to welcome you on this unusually warm day to a panel on contesting history and memory. Of course, history and memory are always contested, both in their own right and in relation to each other. Pierre Nora famously drew a distinction between the two, but that distinction is hard to defend in general, and not least in an era like right now when the primacy of power politics seeks to firmly clasp both history and memory in its yoke. To introduce this panel, and before I introduce the esteemed panelists, let me make three brief remarks. First is that over the last decade, and especially in the last few months in the United States, we've seen the consolidation of a shift from the so-called memory boom of the 1990s, in which countries around the world began to confront long papered over pasts in the wake of the Cold War, to what we might call a reactionary turn through active state repression of history and memory. Consider merely the rise of so-called memory laws that started, well, it didn't start, but especially poignant in Poland and in Russia. The rise of patriotic education of various forms, including in the United States, and the rise of outright reversal and erasure of history, as we're seeing these days, and the destabilizing of the very basis of reality. That's the hallmark of the current administration. So this shift is one thing that I think is on many of our minds around questions of history and memory. The second point is that we are seeing, I think, the revenge of pasts that we thought we had been consigned to the past, to museums and to archives, but their ghosts are very active in ways that can be genuinely frightening. These include the unworked through legacies of the US Civil War, the Cultural Revolution, and partition, to name just a few connected to our discussions here. Third and finally, the control of memory and history always, or attempts to control memory and history, always creates an excess that cannot be fully controlled. That's what makes sites of memory also sites of struggle, and that's what makes the stakes so high around them. It also is what brings into stark relief different strategies for doing both history and memory, and both of them together, including differences between elite and grassroots memories and their representation. I should also add, of course, that technology, especially AI, is challenging the very categories of archiving, imagining, imaging, and creating both history and memory. So to discuss these issues in the context of the current moment, we have assembled a truly stellar panel. Unfortunately, one of the panelists, Manu Goswami from New York University, is unfortunately ill today and unable to join us. But let me allow me to briefly introduce the other panelists in the order of their presentation. First is Professor Prasenjit Dwara, who is the Oscar L. Tang Chair of East Asian Studies at Duke University, and whose extensive work on modernity in East Asia is well known to all of us at ICI. He will be followed by Professor Jane Burbank, Professor Emerita of History and Russian and Slavic Studies at New York University. She is, among many other things, the recipient, along with her co-author Frederick Cooper, of the Toynbee Prize for the Study of Global History. Third is Professor Claire Potter, who is Professor Emerita of History from our very own New School for Social Research. I read her Political Junkie blog religiously, and so should you. For more details on all of their impressive achievements, I refer you to the program. And right now, I would like to turn it over. It's my great pleasure to turn it over to Professor Dwara.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I would like to take the occasion to thank the organizers of the India-China Institute and congratulate them on their 20th anniversary. To thank in particular the directors and the real director, where is she? Grace and Manjari, and there you are. and James. Actually, I have been probably among all of you here, maybe apart from Craig, I've been one of the oldest associates with the pre India-China Institute that was called the Study of Psychosocial Studies. Center for Psychosocial Studies, which in the 90s, 80s and 90s, and then that converted to the Institute for all of a sudden it jumped decades, and Institute for Transnational Studies, and then it became settled into India-China Studies when it came here. So that's the history. And it's been wonderful to have been involved in all of those things. They've had a very important part in my own conceptual sort of developments. So this, I should mention, is not history and memory per se, but it incorporates history and memory. I have been writing for a few years I haven't written very much, one paper, but for a group that calls itself the Civilizationism Group. This is a Stanford and Göttingen collaboration with many other collaborators from several different countries, which began to investigate long before the idea that our new president would become the new president. The idea of civilizationism, by which they meant how these older histories and memories and myths and so on were being revived by populist leaders for the kinds of things that we're seeing now. So I thought it would be very fitting to talk about, and I was assigned to work on the Chinese issue because I had written on Chinese civilizations arguments in the early 20th century and so on. So I thought it would be a good one to sort of pick up. And I had been working simultaneously with the Belt and Road Initiative. And the most interesting thing happened as I was thinking how to link those two, that in 2022, Chairman, do we call him chairman or president? Anyway, Chairman Xi Jinping, I'll use the old mode. Chairman Xi Jinping decided to fold the Belt and Road Initiative. Is anyone unfamiliar with the BRI? Everybody knows it, right? The Belt and Road, I'll give a few details. To fold it or to wrap it in two initiatives. One was called the Security Initiative, and the other was called the Civilizational Initiative. I said, my moment has arrived. This paper is done now. Right? And so then, and in fact, it was also very interesting to see how they plotted, how they actually repurposed BRI for civilizational and strategic. I mean, it's very much a dual use kind of thing. Dual use in the IR sense of the word. And so that's what I'm talking about. So 21st century, China's infrastructure, since BRI, as you know, was principally an infrastructural project, I talk a lot about infrastructure in my notion of civilizationism. So this is a slightly complicated sort of conceptual attempt of mine, and I'll try to explain it perhaps a little more in the discussion. But the sentence that you can read above, and I can read it with you, by V.S. Naipaul, I found one of the most interesting statements on imperialism and civilization. The Europeans wanted gold and slaves like everybody else, but at the same time, they wanted statues put up to themselves as people who had done good things for their slaves. Being at the peak of their powers, they could express both sides of their civilization, and they got both the slaves and the statues, and I should add also the gold, right, which they were searching for. So, I mean, that was quite a trick, right? I mean, how did they do that kind of thing? Relatively well. I mean, obviously you had rebellions, but you have rebellions everywhere. So, so I think what this suggests is that it's not only the desire to take, but to be loved and to be copied, right? And in some ways, I think that is, if you put a slightly Hegelian twist to it, that's part of the civilizational angle that I'm talking about. As I said, beyond the statue, slave, and gold, West got most, the rest to think in terms of modern Western ways. And I think this is the most fundamental mode of copying and imitation, right? That happened, that they were able to successfully, you know, I'm broadly saying West. At different times, there were different powers, different places, but they followed pretty much what we would call post-Enlightenment ideologies. And they got people to think along these categories. So, you know, and I take a lot of this from the John Myers and the Stanford School of Sociology on world systems, which is that nations, all these different societies begin to have some basic similarities, right, in every way, including the very idea of the nation and how the nation is formed. You have to have a past, you have to have a future, you have to have a middle period that rejects the immediate past and brings back the older past, or theoretically, while you progress into the future. Those kinds of things. So they do this, but they also have categories like physical categories, logistic, legal, info-communicative categories, all these categories that we use, normative standards, like the hertz or kilo. Only the US doesn't use those, right? But the rest of the world does. And, or a child, you know, in these, if you look at constitutions around the world, a child who used to be a child, even in my childhood, you know, rural children were children, they were able to work in the fields. Now, in every constitution says you are a child till you're 18, and you know, then you're an adult. You have to have this, and so you know, so we have been civilizationally formed. Not all of us, clearly, not so much of our segments of a rural society and other an urban society, but certainly the middle classes. So now to go back to the early 20th century notion of civilization, in the early 20th century, you know, the Asian nationalists, Chinese, Japanese, Indians, Southeast Asians, a little later, Africans also, began to realize, actually some Latin Americans also, began to realize that the West had legitimated its power over them through a notion of civilization. Not exactly at this infrastructural level that I'm talking about, but you know, by saying we have these glorious pasts and so on, and that's where we got from. So they decided they also needed to have these civilizational categories. So you have the great Hindu civilization, or what Nehru would call the great Indic civilization. The Chinese, of course, have a great Han and have both an inclusive and exclusive civilizational category. The Japanese too, Pan-Asianism and the Yamato, and it's these two notions of civilization that often get these places into trouble. I'm sure with Russia also you can get inner and outer. So through most of the early 20th century, that early 20th century nationalism, except for Japan, which tried to implement Pan-Asianism, not very successfully, but in some quarters it did, all the other Asian nationalisms were mainly directed towards their domestic populations. They were not designed to change the world, to universalize and change the world, and so on. Except I think now, after the Belt and Road Initiative, or after the rise of China, China is not only beginning to develop, to actualize a notion of civilization. We'll come later to what that notion of civilization is. But China is actually trying to actualize the role of the ideals of civilizations through various means of control across much of the world that are through communication modes, through financial communicational, as well as legal and other digital dimensions, which are new dimensions. Okay, so let me go to China now. Now, before 1980, before the opening up of China, the notion of civilization was not very important in Maoist China, right? It was much more about class warfare and the anti-imperialist coalitions and class unities and things like that. What happens is in the 1980s, you begin to get a movement called the Socialist Spiritual Civilization Movement. So this is the word for civilization is Wenming, and it's an original Chinese word that was reconstructed into modern notions of civilization by the Japanese, then brought into China. So Wenming, socialist spiritual civilization was actually brought in because market forces had started producing stratification, and there was an effort to sort of, push back on that kind of idea. And then, but it didn't really go very far, and then because you had then several movements, you had this massive westernization among the elites, so which led to the whole Tiananmen itself was actually the climax that was preceded by this idea of the Yellow River and the Blue Sea, right? Where does civilization, what is the civilization really about? Is it about the Yellow River civilization, which some call China's mother and some call China's sorrow, right? Because it floods over so much. Or is it about the oceans, and it's basically the North Atlantic powers coming by the oceans and bringing Western civilization. And that, as you saw with the Goddess of Liberty and so on, for those of you who remember, led to the Tiananmen massacre. And after that, very interestingly, Jiang Zemin was in power, and he decides that all this Western stuff is not very good. Let's open up. We have an enormous repertoire of Chinese civilization still around, even after the Cultural Revolution. Let's open that up. And then they open that up. What happens? You get a lot of what is called Qigong Re, right? You get a lot of people doing all kinds of traditional Qigong events and so on. And, you can't restrict it. It's a whole epistemology, I guess, or cosmology. Because once you get into this whole Qigong stuff, it leads you to the cosmology, and you get movements like the most prominent of which, you had hundreds of them, like the Falun Gong, who became most prominent, just like the Yikuan Tao was most prominent 30 years before. You get the Falun Gong, and then you get this massive repression and all that Qigong stuff and so on, and using the repertoire of Chinese historical traditions becomes much more limited. And then, so it's this really interesting way in which civilization was sort of, what is it, finding the stones by reaching out for them. The same idea was sort of by treading the water, yes. So in 2000s, civilization suddenly changed to mean something closer to the Western idea, but not exactly, which is suzhi, right? That is social quality, human quality. It may be connected to the World Bank's human capital formation. Who's of good quality. You know, if you're uneducated, if you spit, if you shout when you talk, and so on, I've had experiences of this, you're not civilized. I remember going to a Chinese village and a guy offering me a cigarette. This was actually before all this. And I said, no, I don't smoke. And he looked at me and said, 我知道,不文明. So he says, I know, it's not civilized. so there, so, you know, things like that. So it became, so modern habits and so on. So it created a new type of stratification, right? If you're doing Qigong, okay, you may do it, but you have to be proper human formation, capital human capital formation. Then the late 2000s is when you begin to get, although it started earlier, the notion of ecological civilization. And this is a very important development in China. Ecological civilization mixes the idea of Marxist Enlightenment ideas, progress, Marxist ideas of progress drawn from the Enlightenment, together with Chinese ecosophy, right? So you have a lot of references to Confucius, to all kinds of Confucian and Taoist thinkers who talked about nature and humans and nature and heaven being one and all of that kind of, all those kinds of issues. And here this was, I'm doing it like a page. And this was taken up by first, a very important person who became minister under Xi Jinping for ecological affairs was Pan Yue, and he had some very interesting work. That's Pan Yue on this side. So I give you a picture of this. This is, I don't know if I have time to explain these pictures. But this is socialist industrialization, just as this is in the early 80s. And one of the things you can see in this little picture is that it's still very much socialist realism, but there are commodities sort of thrown about around there, right? So a little bit of commodification, but still socialist realism and so on. Okay, and that's Falun Gong down there. What was that, you guys?
We thought that was an iPhone in the lower
No, almost. Now it would be. Absolutely. Yeah, we may go back to that with an iPhone now. Socialist realism with an iPhone. Yeah. So I said I'll say something about the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road Initiative was started by Xi Jinping, Chairman Xi, in 2013. And as I said, it was packaged with the Strategic Initiative and the Civilization Initiative. And really, under Xi Jinping, China has spent over $1 trillion on infrastructural projects, roads, rails, high-speed rail, dams, ports in the global south, and in much of Europe as well. In fact, in Europe, they're so dependent for their electricity on Huawei, or is it Huawei, that the New York Times recently wrote an essay called "They have the killer switch." So if they switch off the Huawei systems, a lot of Europe would just freeze. So that's dual use technology, as people say. Now, we also know that a BRI was a result of excess capital and overcapacity. Overcapacity, I used to think just meant that they had leftover stuff. But overcapacity apparently means also that you produce more than you need so that you can sell it more cheaply. It's welcomed by many, and I don't want to play down the value of the Belt and Road. It's been valuable for many, many underdeveloped countries which were denied investments which need investments were denied by Western powers and others who could. But they got it, but three problems emerged very quickly within the first 5-6 years. One was the problem that you all heard of, debt. Now, I don't believe in all this debt trap business, but as an intentional thing, I don't think the Chinese were intending to trap anyone, but it does become one when you can't repay it. Of course, on the other hand, if you don't remember, Argentina has defaulted how many times? 6, 8 times? Nothing's happened to it. So the creditor also has a lot to lose there. Not that nothing's happened. I mean, it's in a bad state, but both suffer, as it were. You talk about the Greek haircuts and things. But so debt, environment was also a very big problem because they were going through all kinds of, they had a lot of carbon emissions and going through natural habitats. Yeah, and a digital power, which was, of course, a new type of power that I'll talk a little bit about later. By 2018-19, these complaints led to China revising the kinds of investments. It was now called small and beautiful investments, largely in infotech, some agricultural help, and in Africa and elsewhere. But at the same time, they continued certain infrastructural projects like ports. Ports, especially in Latin America and Southeast Asia, are very important for goods coming in and out and things like that. Ports and mining. Mining is, of course, one of the most important things, especially for rare earths, but also other types of mining. So, but we also know that in recent years, China has been the producer of 60% of renewable forms of energy, and they also export enormous amount. Nobody can compete with their EV and, I mean, whatever the reasons are, whatever kind of state, but it's suddenly, we can talk about that later. EVs and EV batteries, but as I said, mining and oceanic extraction also remains, which is why Trump today, I think, has decided to do international waters deep sea mining, a deep sea activity. This is all, they're all going back and forth. After 2022, as I said, BRI is wrapped in strategic and civilization initiative. And civilization initiative declares partnership with the country in which it is investing and respect for other cultures. And this idea is, and it's summed up in the idea of common destiny of humankind, right? About how we are peacefully penetrating these countries, and but it's very anti-Western. Unlike the West, which doesn't do it peacefully, and which to this day fights wars all over the place, and which to this day charges huge amounts and things. Okay, I just wanted to show a little bit of Chinese. I was in Sri Lanka, this is several years ago, but there's Cheng He, the great admiral who sailed all the way to Africa, and there he's being shown in Sri Lanka as having brought Buddhism and endowed Buddhism to Sri Lanka, and how they have a Buddhist friendship. In Islamic countries, they have an Islamic friendship, and then they even actually trotted out some daughter of a prince captured in Sri Lanka who was brought to Nanjing by the Ming Dynasty, in the Ming Dynasty. And they found her somewhere 500 years later, and they trotted her out. So there's all the soft power stuff going on as well in the global South. I just want to talk a little bit about infrastructural arteries. This is very important. So as I said, one new form of power, actually environment is also a new form of power because it wasn't as politicized in earlier forms of imperialism. But in this form of imperialism or domination or superpower, I'm not calling China imperialist. No, that's not what I'm calling. I think we still have to see. Infrastructural arteries are very important, even more important than they were before. You have the digital Silk Road, right, which is a single platform for digital communications, which accompanies the BRI. Wherever there is a BRI, there is a digital connectivity. And the Chinese companies control and own each of these, the technology as well as the actual ownership in most cases. Then they also design and control the standards, that is the protocols, codes, data storage, and this can, think of it, it can shape information and identity, I would say, even more than what we would have to read, I don't know, Jane Austen or Shakespeare or something to become civilized, right? Now all you have to do is TikTok, could do it as well. Not that I've ever used TikTok, but it's clear that TikTok, WeChat, etc., the algorithmic bias by classification, by suppression of some materials, by calling some of these, is so popular among the youth. And, they create self-presentations, because they create multiple self-presentations, but it's being controlled. Some algorithms allow some. If you want to be an American revolutionary going after, Xi Jinping, do you think that the algorithm will allow you to do that? Or something like that? So, it's being formed. And it's a very different mode than the way we were educated, but it's there. So digital sovereignty over data, all the data that you have, is often also controlled, not always, often always controlled by Beijing. Because often weaker countries cannot challenge that kind of data sovereignty. Then the other thing that the Chinese have developed more than any other is the interoperability, which enables a common language between standardized data formats and protocols to communicate with different systems. So there's a common language and different systems come into it, and you can make sense of it, right? So, and this is good for AI, for finance markets, for biotech, for defense, for all of these things can be controlled through here. So the goal is to establish a global IT infrastructure and supply chain centered around China, adhering to Chinese standards. Okay, I won't do financial arteries. I just wanted to show, that China now owns 40% of Pakistan's stock market. It appoints all the managers and the CEO. The good news is that Pakistan corruption through leakage has come down because of Chinese surveillance systems, right? But what the Chinese, they're moving to instead of just loans and so on, they're moving much more to market systems where you let people buy shares, whoever wants to buy shares, in renminbi, right? You buy shares in renminbi, you get your returns in renminbi, which is one way of actually moving the financial needle, but not yet. So, but this is happening in Kazakhstan, Bangladesh, South Asia, a lot of South Asia. Sri Lanka probably now, I'm not sure. Pakistan, of course. So conclusion, Xi Jinping's version of Chinese civilizationism sees itself as in many ways a fructification of Enlightenment ideals, but on Chinese historical soil, right? So it never fructified where it should have in the West. They became horrible capitalists. But we have, through ecological civilization and so on, we have fructified these ideas. Like the early 20th century ideas of civilizationism, whether it's Tagore or what's his name, Okakura and so on, they talked about the best of the East and the West coming together. But what they were saying is the West is material and the East is spiritual, and that's how they come together. This time it's reversed, right? It's saying, okay, we get the spirit of the Enlightenment from the West, but it is on the historical soil of China that it was able to grow, with our notions of administrative meritocracy, with human nature harmony, with moral leadership of Confucianism, and that is what has allowed China to rise to this new state. So China calls for an inclusive global community of human destiny, but as I have said, all civilizations have a center, and China represents Enlightenment authoritarianism, which is also a familiar Western form. Okay, thank you.
Well, I want to thank the organizers for including Russia on this India-China initiative panel, and it takes me back to the old area studies days when our regional panels were required to bring in some outside expert to legitimize what we were doing. Of course, those were the Eurocentric days, and the outsider was always some Western European historian. Well, today we'll take Russia. And I'll start this panel off with a Soviet perspective on history. In what turned out to be the last days of the USSR, a saying on the topic of history and memory went as follows: Russia is a country with an unpredictable past. Now, that was a joking response to the many flip-flops in official history in communist times. But in fact, history in Russia has been a topic of contestation for centuries. Both scholarship in general and history in particular were state projects in the Grand Princedom of Muscovy, in the Russian Empire, in the Soviet Union, and after a few years of partial chaotic privatization in the 1990s, back again in today's Russian Federation. The past of the state, its origins, its geographic location, the identity of the people who populated the polity or who led it, all these have been matters of controversy, sometimes with very high costs for the participants. So I'll touch only fleetingly upon some of the subjects that have provoked debate or worse among Russia's elites. When professional history got off the ground in the late 18th century, a major irritant was what was called the origins of Rus problem. Who were the 9th century founders of the Rus Empire in the region of today's Ukraine? A wealthy polity based on lucrative trade routes from the Baltic to Byzantium. The early Christian chronicles indicated that Varangian founders came from far away, but nationally minded historians had to strive to prove that the very first Russian state was composed and founded by Slavs. This so-called Norman controversy, these founders were Vikings, was very long-lasting. But so was the imperial mentality of Russia's elites, who took for granted that the whole of Kievan Rus, whatever its origins, was Russian, and the progenitor of Muscovite Russia. The Ukrainian offshoots of Kievan Rus were obliterated from the start from Russian history. State leaders and elites were intensely engaged in producing suitable narratives of Russian history well before 1917. But I'm going to skip ahead to Soviet times, when the struggles over history zigzagged to the tune of the party leadership. Marxism-Leninism became the obligatory method and perspective. This requirement drove some specialists out of the universities and academies and out of the country, but even for historians who stayed in Soviet institutions, a Marxist approach did not provide a permanent, singular, or even acceptable way to interpret the historical imperial past. A main problem was empire. What was the relationship of the USSR to the empire overthrown in 1917, but mostly reincorporated into the successor Soviet Union? In the 1920s, Soviet historians promoted a history of Bolsheviks as the liberators of subject peoples. Anti-colonial struggles were the main thing to remember. But in the 1930s, Stalin reversed course and began to stress the grandeur and achievements of the prior Russian Empire. At each twist of the ideological thread, Scholars gained or lost jobs, some lost their lives, as did many communists of non-Russian origin who had supported the Bolshevik state during and after the revolution. Stalin's short course, here the English translation, The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolshevik, called the short course, it is actually 300 pages long, was published in 1938, and this became the mandatory text for all universities. Stalinist discipline wore off only gradually after his death in 1953. Only in the late 1980s, with Gorbachev's perestroika, did it become possible to revise the history of the party and the revolution. Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, names that had been obliterated from history books for half a century, were reintroduced to Soviet readers, most dramatically through the publication of Mikhail Shatrov's play, Onward, 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 in 1988 in the official journal of the Writers' Union. One of the buzzwords at that time was the search for a usable past. Now, this slogan signals the ongoing ideological impulse behind late Soviet revisionist history. But the most sought after part of the past was not, at the time, very usable. As I discovered while living in Moscow in the perestroika years, what people really wanted to learn about in the past was Stalinism. Soviet citizens sought the histories of their lost, disappeared, silenced family members. And they wanted a history that could enable memory, enable the memories that had been made impossible and dangerous for decades. That search for memory had begun underground in the 1950s as survivors of the camps trickled back into Soviet society. A glimpse of their history had been allowed in 1962 with the sensational publication of Solzhenitsyn's story, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, in Novy Mir. But public discussion of the Gulag was rapidly shut down and punished in the subsequent decades. Still, courageous and clever dissidents made many efforts to recover the memory of Stalin's victims. Most well-known of these endeavors is the Society Memorial, founded underground but only finally recognized by the government, the Soviet government, in 1990. The recovery of memory, of graves, of archives, and even possessions became a widely shared concern in what turned out to be those last years of the Soviet Union. At that turbulent time, the recovery of Stalinist history and the issue of repression became a project of the disintegrating state. On October 18th, 1991, before the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, but after the failed putsch against Gorbachev in August 1991, the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the RSFSR for those in the know, under the leadership of its president, Boris Yeltsin, passed a law entitled On the Rehabilitation of Victims of Political Repression. The Russian Federation, that is the state we know now today as Russia, the successor to the Russian Republic, retained that law. And over the next 20 years, 6 million people brought cases under this law. 4 million people were rehabilitated, and their descendants provided with various kinds of compensation. Legal procedures to rehabilitate and compensate victims of repression alongside the celebratory destruction of monuments to the KGB, the multiple efforts at uncovering Soviet crimes against both citizens and foreigners, the efforts to excavate Gulag graves, and you see an example here, a memorial, the documentation of starvation labor practices, all that seemed in the 1990s to indicate that the Russian Federation was on track to document and analyze the history of Stalinism and to make official amends to the families of those who had been killed or harmed in the Gulag system. In the 1990s, professional historians in the Russian Federation produced new histories of our fatherland to replace the standard history of the USSR. Scholars focused on forbidden topics, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the murders of Polish officers at Katyn, the workings of the KGB, and they published studies and documents to back up their findings. The Yeltsin years were a golden age of international collaboration on research projects, of mostly open archives, of travel and study abroad for historians and would-be historians. Yet only 2 decades after this radical opening up of topics, evidence, and publishing, Russia, under the leadership of a new president who had made his career in the KGB, began both to close off access to historical documents and to produce a new state-endorsed historical narrative. The centennial of the Bolshevik Revolution in 2017 offered an opportunity to showcase what Russia was really about. Advisors to Putin and leaders of the Orthodox Church collaborated to produce a gigantic mall-scale exhibit implanted in dozens of cities across the Russian Federation in 2017 and later years. These exhibits' title, Russia, My History, set forth the goal. Spectators were to discover their past and identify with it. Their past was illuminated in videos, light shows, digital displays, games, and quizzes in 2 gigantic halls. This new official reading of Russia's past was full of surprises for people like me. Lenin was presented in his terrorist mode, and the hero martyrs of the revolutionary years turned out to be the members of the imperial family whose assassination Lenin had ordered. This was consistent with the exhibit's story of Russia's imperial glory and with the Orthodox Church's vaunting its defense of traditional Russian values. More predictably, the Second World War was the major episode proving Russia's glory in the 20th century. However, the Hitler-Stalin Pact was barely visible. The emphasis in the run-up to the war was on the sellout of Russia in the 1930s by Western powers. This accorded with the second major theme of the exhibit, Russia as a victim of the West. Russia's earliest centuries were depicted in an anti-Western fashion. The Teutonic Knights were worse than the Mongols. On the walls of the exhibit were projections of faces and words of experts, scholars, literary figures, philosophers. Prominent among them was the guru of Eurasian theory, Lev Gumilyov. Gumilyov's looming presence over the exhibit, the exhibit's positive gloss on the Mongols, the theme of betrayal by the corrupt West, the elevation of Russian orthodoxy to an imperial faith, all this signaled a new anti-Western canon. So now I turn to what I signaled with my topic title, that is, Russia Goes East. The ideology that underlay Russia, My History exhibit was a renewed and revised vision of Eurasianism. Russian Eurasianism, the creation of Russian emigres after the revolution of 1917, had been, it was thought, effectively snuffed out by Soviet authorities in the 1930s. But Gumilyov, who had spent 13 years in the Gulag, had survived to become a revered influencer in late Soviet society. His communications foregrounded Russia's ethnic connection to nomadic peoples on the Eurasian steppe. Russia thus had the resources, Gumilyov argued, to become a super ethnos led by a charismatic Emperor Khan in a struggle against competing but dangerous ethnic collectives. These themes then were tweaked and publicized widely in the 1990s by Alexander Dugin. Dugin, the self-styled philosopher well known today as an advisor to Putin. In 1997, Dugin published a 600-page textbook entitled The Foundation of Geopolitics, the Geopolitical Future of Russia. He wanted to produce a handbook for Russian elites, and the book was published with the support of the Russian Military Academy. It was subsequently used at many universities and institutes. It included texts by Eurasianists from the early 20th century, as well as Carl Schmitt and other writers deemed classics of geopolitical thought. Correcting Samuel Huntington, whose Clash of Civilizations theory had attracted many Russian intellectuals, Dugin asserted that the major divide was not between the West and the rest, or the Atlantic order and world chaos, but a confrontation of two different world orders, each with its own structure, its own values, its own ideals and methodologies, the Atlantic world and the Russian Eurasian one. Russians were, he wrote, people of empire, and their fate depended on facing geopolitical reality and building a new empire. This new empire, Dugin wrote in 1997, must be Eurasian, span a great continent, and in the future, the world. Foundations of Geopolitics provided a charter for recovering Russian power in the space of the former Soviet Empire and abroad. One chapter was devoted to the ominous subject of Russia's near abroad, described as a geopolitical problem. According to Dugin, people of the former Soviet bloc and other countries on Russia's borders had only two options: either become a colony of the United States and its one-worldism, or join with a great power that offered an alternative, Russia's Eurasian empire. Within a decade, Dugin achieved something no Eurasianist had accomplished before: the insertion of his theories into the mindset of the Russian officials, military leaders, and advisors to the president. Eurasianism was an attractive ideology for elites and others disheartened by their loss of status in the curtailed empire and in the world of great power politics. Dugin's influence, direct or indirect, burst onto the international scene with the war in Ukraine, which he had been advocating since the 1990s, and especially after the assassination of his daughter, Daria, in August 2022. Dugin-style Eurasianism, merged with Russian world rhetoric, permeates Putin's speeches on Russia's past and seems to set in place, for a while at least, another revision of Russian history. Russia-Eurasia is the new geopolitical unit set against the Atlantic world, the US and Europe. Communist contests over the imperial past seem to be resolved in this version of the past. Empire is back. Russia today has its roots, this is the narrative, it has its roots in Kiev that conveniently settled the Ukrainian question. The empire took shape in Muscovy, grew strong and large under the Tsars, and was great again under the communists. But the USSR should have been tougher with its nationalities, it was an error to have made secession a possibility for the Soviet republics. Lenin created Ukraine with early Soviet nationalities policies, another of his mistakes. Religion, of course, has made a comeback too with a Eurasian imprint. Russia-Eurasia is a space for multiple traditional religions. This means Russian Orthodoxy for Christians and institutionalized Islam and Judaism led by well-disciplined, loyal hierarchs. Tradition also means repression of LGBTQT as perverse and unnatural. The constant element in this hodgepodge of themes is the stark cultural and political divide between Russia-Eurasia and the West. A corollary is the victimization of Russia-Eurasia, first by the Europeans and later by the United States. Russia's turn to the East is based positively on a shared history across Eurasian space and negatively on the need to ally against the evils of the Europeans' fake and evil so-called civilization. Another religious photo here. Such is the new Russian history, unpredicted for sure. It goes against 3 centuries of Russian elite strivings to become European, or at least to be recognized as a European power. And what about memory? The many projects directed at discovery and knowledge of the Stalinist past have been shut down. Graves of the assassinated are being reattributed to Russia's enemies. The huge archive compiled by the Memorial Society has been confiscated. Memorial, the society, was declared to be a foreign agent in 2014. In 2021, it was ordered to close down all branches of the Russian Federation. Those who defend Memorial are defined as foreign agents, put on trial, isolated in prison cells and labor camps, or murdered at home and abroad. So much for memory. I conclude my remarks with some new developments in Russian Eurasianism and in Dugin's prospects for the future that relate directly to the geopolitical themes of our conference. Eurasianism in its many forms always meant looking, absorbing, expanding to the east, not the west. But which east? Dugin's influential textbook from 1997 contained maps that described his vision for the new Russia-Eurasia in the global struggle. Note that in this map, China is outside the borders, most of it, of the allied Eurasian peoples. This gesture conformed to the early Eurasianist sense that both China and Persia were great civilizations on Eurasian borders that had distinctive cultures and distinctive ways of life, not Eurasia. In 1925, Trubetskoy had argued in his provocative study, The Legacy of Chinggis Khan, that Chinggis had made a great mistake when he tried to conquer China. That conforms to these ideas about what is part of the Eurasian world at the time, in the 1990s and early 2000s. Dugin himself used to regard China as a threat to Russia's command across the continent. But recently, Dugin has come to see China as a partner with Russia in what he calls a geopolitical alliance opposed to the Atlanticist world order. He lectured at China's highly regarded Fudan University in 2018, and he is a research fellow there. He also has a position at a university in Moscow. What is more, Dugin's theories have caught on with some high-ranking Chinese advisors. When Xi Jinping made his state visit to Paris last year, he was accompanied by Zhang Weiwei, an intellectual close to Dugin, and an advocate for the Russian-Chinese alliance. Zhang Weiwei made his disdain for the United States and Western systems clear. Le Monde quoted him in Paris on May 3rd, 2024. You think your democratic system is better? Fine, take good care of it. We're not interested. So both the wide appeal of multipolarity, with its clear signal that there are poles, that is, great powers around which global politics should be organized, and the reality of China's enormous power, should make us pay attention to, if not appreciate, the challenge posed by Russia's latest revision of its history and memory. What matters now is Eurasian. And that is another map from Dugin's 1997 book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I always, as the U.S. person on such a distinguished panel, I always start by feeling so provincial. You know, we in the United States, and particularly historians, we divide up the scant 400 years of U.S. history into 100-year chunks. And so even within our own disciplines, we're provincial. So I want to start by saying that I think the Trump administration, when we think about history in the United States and the role that history has played in politics, the Trump administration is, in fact, the gift that keeps on giving. And I want to start with a couple of points. One is that when Donald Trump became president, he announced that his favorite president was William McKinley, which seems strange to a great many of us because McKinley is most famous for having started the 1898 war, which was in many ways a huge failure. And he's also very famous for having been assassinated and allowing Theodore Roosevelt to become president, which was a whole other kind of disaster. But when you think about it, actually McKinley has a few historical traits that I understand why Trump admires. The first is that he was beloved. And I know this because I worked with a graduate student in historical studies many years ago named Grace Song, who wrote her master's thesis about William McKinley. And McKinley was beloved around the United States and sort of seen as the ideal man. The second thing, of course, which I think, you know, depending on how you feel about the War of 1898, I say it was a huge failure. It was also the United States' first great colonial enterprise outside North America, right? And it happens in part because the West has, quote unquote, been won, okay? And the great hope that American politicians had for the North American West was that it would become this huge market for goods and building railroads and so on and so forth. Two things about that. One is it kind of happens, but the other thing is that it represents a sort of set of serial failures, okay, in which there are these increasingly quick cycles of boom and bust. And one of the features of that boom and bust, okay, so McKinley becomes president in 1896, 3 years after the worst depression in United States history, even compared to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And almost immediately imposes a series of brutal tariffs, otherwise known as the McKinley tariffs. And this, I also think, Donald Trump admires, and that he did it actually without the backing of his party. Nobody liked the McKinley tariffs. And in fact, they drive the United States into another Great Depression. The third thing about McKinley, and this will seem trivial to begin with, but you'll get where I'm going, is McKinley probably has the most statues and monuments made to him of any American president, or in fact, any American figure, Okay, again, I learned all this from Grace Song, who wrote about these statues. When McKinley is assassinated, the United States goes into this paroxysm of grief for McKinley. And part of how they get out of this state of grief is towns start building monuments to McKinley. So there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of statues of William McKinley that pop up all over the country between 1901 and 1905. All right, hold that thought. Now, remembrance of the past, of course, has a great deal to do with such monuments. It also has a great deal to do with textbooks. It has a great deal to do with museums. These have always, history in this sense, have always been a series of political acts, all right? So at this moment in time, as the Trump administration is seizing control of what we might call the means of production, right? Whether it is entire universities, whether it is canceling NEH grants, which they did 3 weeks ago, not just to individual scholars, but to museums and local historical societies and so on. They're really seizing control of the means of making history. Now, the question is, what are they going to do with it? So the one thing we know right now is Presidential Executive Order 13978, which was signed on January 29th, 2025, to very little fanfare. It takes a long time for people to catch up with Donald Trump. And what this executive order does is establish the National Garden of American Heroes, which is a sculpture garden. I'm not actually quite sure where it's going to be put yet, but all the money that was supposed to go to the National Endowment for the Humanities this year, all of our colleagues who got their little $60,000 grants canceled, all of that money will go to the sculpture garden, which will feature 250 figures from the American past. Why 250? Because it's supposed to open next year on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Okay, so this is what we call patriotic history. And patriotic history is a concept that is familiar to most of us. It's a Russian phenomenon. It sort of describes what you just talked about, Jane. But patriotic history, the purpose of it is to establish the eternal quality of the nation and the inherent goodness of the nation. And it points this moment of reestablishing patriotic history, which is, by the way, something that the American right has been working on for decades. This is not new. Points to the dangers of a certain liberal idea about history that has been, really important to new research, but also has its flaws, which is the idea of inclusion. That if we actually include everybody in the American story, we will get a more accurate, a more sympathetic, a more textured, and a more just sense of the history of the nation. Now, patriotic history thrived between 1877 and World War I, and then it sort of disappears into the landscape. And the reason I'm pointing to this period of time is that this is a period in which public monuments and birthplaces are emerging all over the United States. And many of these public monuments are intended to celebrate the Confederate States of America as an aspect of American history that is part of our national story, all right? So several years ago, when we saw activism around taking down these monuments, what we saw was that it was mostly happening in the former Confederacy, in these former slave states. In fact, there are Confederate monuments all over the 5 boroughs of New York. And part of the work of the Daughters of the Confederacy was to take this history to places where it might not otherwise be known, okay? So think about this concept of like how things get jumbled in together and how they get jumbled into our consciousness as I proceed to talk a little bit about this Garden of American Heroes sculpture garden. Now, part of the point of this sculpture garden is to address certain ideas about identity, certain kinds of grievances that have accumulated as part of the MAGA movement. It's how, for example, you end up with someone like Columbus in the Garden of American Heroes, because in fact, Columbus never set foot in North America. There was no United States. He barely put his feet down in what became the Dominican Republic, and then he got sick and was taken back to Spain and incarcerated. Excuse me? Yes, the Gulf of America. Exactly. And so there are these grievances that have accumulated on the MAGA right that the Garden of American Heroes tries to address. But what the Garden of American Heroes also tries to do is say, hey, we're not racists. We're going to include a lot of other heroes too. Now, let me tell you who these people are. There are significant numbers of women and people of color who are commissionable statues in this garden, as well as some suspiciously leftist characters. But let me tell you some of the people who are there. I mentioned Christopher Columbus, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who was a Polish general during the, again, not American, but he did come over here to fight during the American Revolution, and the Marquis de Lafayette. He'll be in the garden too. But let's just assume these people are put in alphabetical order. Aretha Franklin will stand next to Benjamin Franklin. Sam Houston will stand next to Whitney Houston. Emily Dickinson will be next to Walt Disney. Barry Goldwater next to Samuel Gompers. Jeanette Rankin next to Ronald Reagan. Alex Trebek next to Harry Truman. John Wayne next to Ida B. Wells. Also, Hannah Arendt is going to be in the Garden of American Heroes. I have no idea why Hannah Arendt is in the Garden of American Heroes. Now, there are significant numbers of Native Americans in the garden, but there are no Chinese Americans or Indian Americans at all, except for one, Admiral Gordon Chung Hoon, whose mother was Hawaiian. Okay, so he was born and raised in Hawaii, and he had an ethnically Chinese father. But this is a really significant gap here, and I want to come back to what that gap says about our history. What I also want to say before I leave the garden is that there are, in fact, queer and queer-adjacent Americans who will probably not be noted as such. I'm referring to Emily Dickinson, Alexander Hamilton, Barbara Jordan, Abraham Lincoln, John Singer Sargent, and Walt Whitman. Okay, so they will be in the garden too, but probably not marked as queer because that would be too woke. So here we have money being pulled out of doing real history, okay, whether that is scholarship or whether it's public-facing history or plays or whatever, and it is being put into statues that do nothing but represent, okay? Now, because this panel engages in questions of contested memory and remembrance in 21st century China and Russia and India initially, I did notice the gap, okay? And here's my theory. And let me just say, I think this list was probably put together by AI. I actually do. But here's my theory, that Chinese and Indian people in the United States represented one of the greatest challenges to liberal citizenship in the 19th and 20th century, okay? Some of you may recall that there are two acts passed in 1873 and 1877 that render people from Asia perpetual foreigners, okay? And the language of the law is that it is impossible for these people to become American, therefore they cannot become citizens. And secondly, there is a really, really important lawsuit filed by an Indian immigrant to the United States challenging the racial qualifications for citizenship, challenging these exclusion laws. And he challenges it through the language of scientific racism, okay? So there is this whole Madison Grant chart of the races, but Caucasians, which are Europeans, are said to have migrated north from India, okay? So this guy ends up in court and he's like, I'm Caucasian, right? Now, the Trump administration isn't exactly smart enough to figure all of this out, but I think that in a moment of heightened nativism, it is interesting to see historically who ultimately is included and who isn't, okay? So Black Americans are not excluded, although, you know, there's little or no reference to the circumstances under which African people came to the United States. And secondly, we might think of the Jeffersonian racial approach in relation to Native Americans, that Thomas Jefferson believed that ultimately Native American people would become white, okay? But there is this sort of taint of unassimilability that is sticking to people from Asia and South Asia that is represented in the garden. Now, I think the Trump administration represents a kind of pivot point for a long contest over what history is, how it is produced, and how it is taught. And they're basically like three phases of how we produce history in the United States. The first is history as literature, right? Of these sort of, there's actually a vast women's history in the 19th century, which few people talk about anymore, but it was called Women Worthies, you know, and it was biographies of people like Martha Washington and so on, mothers of the country. But history is actually a literary pursuit until the 1880s, when at Columbia University chiefly, and also in Germany, the historians start talking to political scientists and legal scholars and so on. And so this new idea of scientific history emerges. Now, scientific history contains a very large tolerance and predilection for propaganda, okay? And what we see in the United States in particular is a whole set of racial assumptions that are built into this sort of early scientific history paradigms. But also a porting of, and back to those statues, a porting of this idea about a heroic Southern past into the larger American story, which actually requires the denigration of anybody who is not white. Then we have a second period of American history, which is a kind of revisionism that begins to occur during the 1930s and through the 50s, which looks back on that scientific history and begins to delve into it. People like C. Vann Woodward, for example, reopen questions originally pioneered by W.E.B. Du Bois in Black history. And then by the 1960s, we have a whole different period, which is specifically because of the Vietnam War and a variety of social revolutions, feminism, the Black civil rights struggle, and so on, that sort of look at, well, what would happen if we looked at history from below, okay? So by the time we get to the 60s and 70s, there was a powerful movement against patriotic history. And that movement actually begins to change how textbooks are written. It doesn't change museum work as much as it should until the 1990s, but it begins to raise questions about the story. And you begin to see books like James Loewen, Lies My Teacher Told Me, people like Howard Zinn writing popular histories from below. So the public controversies about historical representation that we've seen in the last several decades really kind of spring off this anti-patriotic history, right? And they have been in conflict with, patriotic history did not go away, and there's a reason why people love it. The removal of Confederate statues has been one flashpoint. There are others. But one of the things I think is interesting about the Garden of American Heroes is that there are notable absences. John C. Calhoun, who was the political philosopher who basically imagined the shape of the Confederacy, and a slave owner. Robert E. Lee, one of the most ubiquitous statues in the South is Robert E. Lee. He's not in the Garden of American History's. Stonewall Jackson, not in the garden, okay? So you've got Alex Trebek, but you haven't got Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. It just makes no sense as history, but it makes a lot of sense as public relations, okay? So what we're seeing in the Trump administration is, in a lot of ways, history as a public relations strategy. Now, some of these tendencies that we're seeing emerge as national policy have just been around for a long time. For example, there have been pervasive issues with textbooks for years, particularly in the American South. I had a colleague at the University of Virginia who opened up her child's New American History textbook one day and discovered that there was a long part about enslaved people who volunteered for the Confederate Army. So deeply did they believe in the mission of the Confederacy, right? And she took it to the school and said, what the ever-loving fuck? And they said, wow, there are sources. And the sources that had been written from was a Daughters of the Confederacy website. Okay, so the Daughters of the Confederacy have continued to move a narrative that does, in fact, end up in textbooks, and these textbooks are distributed very widely. These twisted interpretations and censorship of other kinds of critical thought about history are perpetuated in part by the importance of Texas and Florida in the national textbook market. Okay, so, and we should expect to see more of that in the coming years, all right? That as laws have been passed in Texas and Florida that forbid the teaching of certain kinds of things, that will drive the national textbook market, okay? No one should be learning out of textbooks anyway, but school systems do, and they do because of course, testing. So these laws have not only affected textbooks, but they have also had a chilling effect on including Black, LGBT, gender histories, women's histories in curricula and in supplementary materials. One of the things we're seeing in classrooms, for example, is teachers simply taking all the books out of their classrooms because they don't know what they're going to get disciplined for. So thinking about museums, books, and public history and what they can do is also an important way of thinking about why the NEH funding had to be taken away and put into a large field of toys. These institutions offer argumentation and possible meaning. What they also do is ask people to think. And there's no better example of this from my point of view. I was in Nashville last summer, and I went to two museums, the Country Music Hall of Fame, which that was on my bucket list for sure. But then there's also a museum of African American music that's funded by the Smithsonian. And there could not be two more different museums. Country Music Hall of Fame is wildly inclusive. Women, Black artists, Asian artists, blah, blah, blah. There are all of these exhibits that show people's costumes and so on and so forth. But the Museum of African American Music not only introduces you to different musical styles, it invites you to write songs. So you actually go into rooms and you listen to a whole story about how gospel is written and where it comes from and what its history is. And then there's a board you can go to and write your own gospel song, right? So it's a museum that encourages not just learning as opposed to observing, but making and imagining yourself in the role of somebody who writes and sings gospel. Now, the problem with the way museums and all these public institutions are funded is that they usually depend very, very heavily on government funding. And this is, of course, what the next 2 to 4 years are going to be crucial to. They allow, as Jane has pointed out, they allow the state to choose what histories are aligned with its political mission and its view of the nation and which ones aren't, and to replace older histories with newer ones that are more useful. As we can see in the garden, they can elevate representation over critical thinking about what it represents. Now, in the late 20th, early 21st century, I think we see a political pivot point for how the right organizes around taking down museums and promoting a different idea of curation when we see the cancellation of the Enola Gay exhibit in 1995. Now, this was an exhibit that was originally intended at the Smithsonian to explore the decision to use atomic weapons, against Japan, okay? This exhibit was such an object of attack from the political right and from veterans organizations that it was canceled completely, and it was redone into an exhibit that simply represented the attack on Hiroshima. And just to let you know, actually the plane, the Enola Gay, was part of that. The Enola Gay was recently flagged at the Pentagon to be taken down as an example of DEI because because it's gay. Okay, they put it back up. Now, all of these objects that we're talking about are in fact legacies of colonialism that shape our collective memory. They require critical thought. So that when in fact you create something that purports to be historical, that creates no room for creative thought, that makes no sense, okay? The Garden of American Heroes makes no sense at all. When you do that, you are suggesting that history is simply a series of facts that don't require positions, they don't require arguments, they don't require engagement. And this is, of course, part of what we're hearing from conservative educators. Just teach the facts in your history classes. Forget all that other junk. Forget the Hannah Arendt part. Now, I would like to say two other things. One is, what happens to all of those statues of McKinley? You don't know. I didn't know until I met Grace Song. By 1905, people are less enamored of McKinley, and yet they've got these statues all over town. So they start writing the McKinley birthplace and saying, you know, we got this statue, and we were wondering if you'd like it. And the McKinley birthplace takes a couple of them, but then, like, you know, they're more and more saying, McKinley statue, got it, we'll send it, we'll ship it. And they're like, no. And so McKinley statues start ending up on the doorstep. You know, like Wells Fargo shows up with a McKinley statue. So if you go to the McKinley birthplace today, there is a garden of William McKinley's behind it, right? I suspect this will be the fate of the Garden of American Heroes because there is no logic behind it. But I would also like to say that this does not mean that the Trump administration is entirely without a sense of history. And this is where I want to close. There are sort of three basic historical theories that the Trump administration runs on. One is the idea of American exceptionalism, that the United States is a unique place that deserves to be master of its own destiny, and that it perfected democracy, okay? And so as you're sort of watching them try to figure out how all of the authoritarian things they do make sense as democracy, well, sometimes democracy just requires that somebody take charge, right? Think about American exceptionalism and the long history of argumentation that suggests that the United States has a unique role in the world. Second, manifest destiny. Okay, the notion that there is a kind of westward push of civilization that should take not just take up the entire all of North America, but in fact, manifest destiny included the potential colonization of China, not physically, but through the marketplace. Okay, so there is this huge dream that China is going to be this endless place to dump cheap American goods. Well, where are we? We've reversed that completely, all right? The masculine United States dumping in feminine China, America is now in the feminine position in that manifest destiny logic. And finally, the idea of the United States as a Christian nation founded on Christian faith, okay? And this too is a theory of history, one that's much more akin to, say, European feudalism than anything else. But nevertheless, it promotes the idea of inevitability. And I'd just like to close by making two observations. One is that the United States has decided to go to war with China economically, and will lose. I mean, there's no question in my mind, in part because there doesn't seem to be anybody in the administration who understands the history of China. If you know, even if you know it as casually as I do, you know that actually shame and humiliation are not part of the package. But the other thing that I think is interesting is that at last the United States has its eye on India, okay? And in more than a cultural religious sense, which is, of course, what happens after World War II, is there's this sort of emphasis on spirituality and the lessons, the political lessons about peace and gentleness and spirituality that India has to teach. But I think J.D. Vance's recent visit to India with his Indian wife, okay, and Indian children, or partly Indian children at least, to visit with Modi. And what Vance said, India is the future, okay? So what I imagine is that the United States wants to swap out China for India, and that India will be our partner, or that it's their view that India should be our partner. But I also want to take you back to that lawsuit around American Citizen. I think we will begin to see South Asian people reconfigured as white in this relationship. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Prasenjit. History as PR strategy. Well, you can't spell propaganda without PR. These were three really wide-ranging, fascinating, scary presentations. In the interests of our limited time, I think it would be great to collect a few questions now, and we can see how many rounds we can do before we have to stop so that we can make it to the next panel. So I see immediately 1, 2, 3 hands. Let's start with these and do one round. So please.
I have a question for Jane. You know, in Russia's narrative, it always connected Ukraine with the Nazi, because in the Second World War, the Ukraine fought on the side of the Russia. But that doesn't mean the Ukraine like Nazi Germany, because they hated Russian more than the Germany. Like in the First World War, the Ukraine was on the side of Germany. In the 17th century of the Sweden and the Russian war, it was on the side of Sweden. Just like in the Second World War, there are plenty of the Southeast Asia people fought with the Japanese fighting against the former colonists. So in your research, I'm wondering how do you evaluate this kind of topic, this kind of things that is Russia's narrative always connected the Nazi Germany with the Ukraine. Try to defend. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is specifically for Professor Birnbach. So when we are going to talk about contesting memory, we're always talking about the memory articulate or manipulate by the few, and the memory discovered by the many, the mass people, right? And from my limited knowledge, I think the mass people, they always find a way to discover the authentic memory or the history, because the mass people live longer than the powerful few, right? After the Putin stepped down, people will find a way to discover what is the authentic narrative or the memory. And let me put my question in this way. How do you think, like, people nowadays, at this moment, they really believe in those topics you are discussing? like the Russia-Euro-Asianism or the patriotic education by the American government or the BRI project, like how the mass people they are currently really believe in that kind of narrative. This is my question because, for example, the Zhang Weiwei, like he is famous in China, but people like me, the young generation, we don't really believe in that. We make fun of him, right? We even though he has been taken as a good example to show how historian may like put this kind of grand project, but actually from my perspective, like we don't trust him or believe him. So this is my question. Yeah.
The concept of representation, the way you said it, Jane, sounds to me like it's a mirror of the facts. I learned from Jane that history is unpredictable because historians always rewrite history. That's re-presentation. So I sense there's some ambiguity how the two of you look at the past, and I wonder whether I'm catching the right disagreement.
Well, a lot of questions here. Well, one thing about to start off with Ukraine being defined by the Russians as Nazis, during World War II, some Ukrainians did fight with Nazis against the Soviets, but certainly not all. And this is the most important aspect, I think, of this question is that we really shouldn't be talking about Ukraine as a whole thing and Ukrainian people all thinking alike. This relates again to the mass question too. So after during World War I, in fact, and after the revolution, when the Ukrainian Rada did declare its independence during the revolution of 1917-18, again, this whole area was very, very split. And so, yes, there were a few people who are on the side of the Germans. There were, and there were some Nazis Nazi types. I mean, people who fled into Ukraine, to Nazi propaganda there. But there were also liberals, anarchists, peasant rebels, mass movement against the Red Army by the part of various peasant groups. So it was highly divided during the aftermath of World War I and the Revolution. Also highly divided society during World War II. But one does have to remember why there were people so opposed to Soviet power. And that is following upon a genocide, now described as such, during the 30s, and the deaths of so many Ukrainian peasants that affected so many families. And that I think was the major push during World War II. But I like the fact that you thought back to the war with Sweden, because I do think we were thinking about geopolitics. After all, Hetman Khmelnytsky was one of the richest men in Europe during the battles between Sweden and Russia at that time, and I always think how much history would have been different if the Swedes had won. But I will just very briefly say something about mass perceptions of history and memory. I'm not so sure if your confidence of memory when you really have an effort over a very long time over more than a generation, to eradicate it. And it takes time even for people to be able to ask questions in various situations. But when you have, from the 1930s, the purges and collectivization killing so many people in Russia, I'm not going to speak about China, that's a significantly long time ago, and much memory truly is lost. And this is, again, where you see the state taking a stance to destroy it even further by taking over the archive. So the archive of Memorial. Mm-hmm. This society has been working so hard to document people who died, as in that picture that I showed of that gravestone. It's been working so hard to identify who exactly died. By the way, 89 Ukrainian writers were slaughtered in one day by that gravestone. But so I think states can work really hard to knock out memory from availability, both to professional historians and to masses. But I'll conclude then, okay, is Eurasianism believed by the Russian masses? Well, I want to turn this around a bit and say one thing about the Russian elites. When I was in Russia in the 1990s, somebody gave me a book by Gumilyov. I mean, he was a guru of quite crazy but very interesting ethnological writings and speeches. But nobody talked to me about Dugin. I mean, I was going to the archives near the Russian Academy, military academy. I saw generals. I ate donuts at the same shop and tried not to starve at the same time. But nobody talked to me about this textbook. None of my intellectual friends talked to me about this textbook. And yet, here was a textbook printed in large numbers that was then being used by many people. And after I was doing research on this project, I discovered how Eurasianism became extremely well-known and widespread. There were sociologists writing other books called Eurasianism this, Eurasianism that. Patrice Lumumba University had a symposium on Eurasianism. And all of this was under the radar for your intellectual types like me. So here's a case where a certain level of society did know about, was being exposed to these theories in the 1990s, a certain level of Russian elites, but it seemed to be outside the serious academic professional realm. I'll stop there.
Yeah, a couple things. One is to get back to the representation of Ukrainians, or at least political Ukrainians, as Nazis. I think that was aimed at the United States because Europeans know what Nazis are, but Americans know Nazis from the movies. And particularly, you know, the use of Nazi as a kind of generic slur against people on the right that you don't like. And some of them are Nazis, but the vast majority of them aren't real Nazis. But I think that was aimed at the United States as much as anything else. The second thing is this question of representation versus representation. Certainly when it comes to the Confederate statues or any kind of political statue, I think one of the things that's very important to remember is that they represent different things to different people. So that one of the arguments for removing Confederate statues was not just that these were like traitorous bastards, and it really sort of, it gathers steam during the Trump administration and after January 6th. There's this sort of intensification of a desire to scrub these people from the public sphere. But it's also important to remember that most of them are in front of courthouses or at campuses that were segregated and did not permit Black people to enroll. And it was almost like having a guard at the door saying, you don't belong, and by the way, we might kill you if you try. And so that's what these statues represented to Black people. White Southerners would often say, that represents my history and heritage, you know? And I think this speaks to the condition of Trumpism as well. I can't remember who wrote this piece, but I read it the other day, thought it was brilliant. It was Paul Waldman wrote it in his Substack about why it is that poor people vote for Trump. And when Trump gets up and says, you know, I'm going to bring back coal, and they're going to be beautiful coal jobs that are really well paid, and you're going to love them, and that people in coal country know that's a lie when they hear it. But what they are also hearing is Trump sees me because my grandfather was a miner, and the road that I grew up on was named for a miner, and my high school was named for a miner, and so that the idea that somewhere deep in their hearts they are still miners, even though there's no mining, is what they're hearing from Trump. I see you, right? And so I think the question of representation here is I think there are people who become hyper-visible because of such a statue, Black people, abolitionists, but there are people who feel seen in a society where racism is no longer okay, and that they're able to sort of harbor that part of themselves, and that's what the representation means. I don't think the United States really represents things except in the case of museums, and it's extraordinarily difficult. I mean, there's a big redo of the Museum of Natural History uptown that has been planned for years to get rid of all of these racist exhibits, and they can't get it done. And now it's probably not going to be done during the Trump administration. So the question of representation is actually a lot harder than representation in this country.
All right. Well, this has been a fascinating panel where we've delved into civilizational politics, geopolitics, and phantasmagorical politics. We are going to transition seamlessly in about 10 minutes into the last panel, India and China in the Making of a Post-Liberal World. So don't go far away. And please join me in thanking our amazing panelists.
Thank you.